Alright guys, so today I got another Rippaverse video for you here, which this is one I've personally been waiting on for quite a while, because I finally have in my hands Bloodruth #1. In fact, I have two different versions of this book, which I'll be going through both those in a second, but first I actually have something a little extra in this video, since for the first time ever I have picked up some merchandise to go along with this book. When Rippaverse has always released, various merchandise items along with their book releases, be it t-shirts or hats or posters or what have you. And I've never bought any of their non-book items, mostly because I was just trying to, control my spending. But this time they had something that I just couldn't pass up when I saw this. So I also have the Bloodruth plushie, who is absolutely adorable. So they released this in the Bloodruth collection along with the books, and as soon as I saw this thing I knew I had to buy it just because I thought it was really cute. Now this thing was $30, but I think that was a okay price. I'm not sure exactly the height on this thing. It's a few inches tall. It's a nice little chibi-eyed plush of Sydney Bloodruth, the main character from this comic. Which, as far as the item itself goes, it is a very nice quality. The hair on this thing is really soft. But it's well put together. Quality item. Which, a few things to note, the jacket on this is not sewn on, so it is actually completely removable. So if you want to take the jacket off, you can. You can also remove the little belt piece from the jacket if you wanted to for some reason. The hat is sewed on, so you can't take the hat off. But if you want to take off the jacket and pose her without the jacket, that is an option. But it is a nice quality little plush. I do love the way it looks. My only real complaint with this thing is that it is made in China. But, I understand that the realities of getting stuff made in the US isn't always what we want them to be. So I'm willing to be a little forgiving on that end. But yeah, I do like this plush. I think it is very nice. So beyond that, we do have the books themselves, which is of course the main feature of this video. So I have two different versions of this book because I have picked up both the standard cover A of Bloodruth #1, which is the cover by Kanan White, which you can never go wrong with a Kanan White cover. He's very, very good at what he does. So I have that, and then in addition, I also picked up the black and white edition of Bloodruth. So this is the same book. It is, of course, just in black and white as opposed to color, which this is the first time Rippaverse has done a black and white release of any of their books, which this is a fitting release to do it with, considering it is a horror title. So I couldn't decide which one of these I wanted to go with, so I wound up just picking up both, which price-wise, the black and white version is cheaper, which the standard color edition, at least for the cover that I got, if I remember correctly, I think it was $29. And the black and white edition was only like $15. So if you forego the color, you can save a few bucks. Now, I'll throw up some screenshot comparisons of the color versus the black and white so you can kind of get an idea of the differences between them. Which I do like both quite a bit. But if I had to pick one, I think I definitely would go with the color option. Which, one thing I'll point out, with the black and white, I kind of wish that they went with a black and white and red edition for this book. And colored in, like, the blood and a few other items that are just red. And left everything else in black and white, just to make those few certain things pop. And the reason I say that is there are a few scenes in this book where in the black and white edition, things don't really come across as clearly as they do in the color edition. Like, for example, there's one scene really early on in the book where blood is like raining from the sky, and that looks really cool in the color edition, but in the black and white version, you pretty much can't even tell that it's raining at all. And then also some of the scenes where Bloodruth is doing like the red glowy eyes thing and using her powers. Again, that doesn't really translate well in black and white. and you can't really tell that she's even using her powers in those scenes. So there's a few things like that that I thought could really benefit from having a touch of red added to the black and white to kind of convey that a little bit better. But overall, I still did really like the black and white version. But if you are only going to get one version of this book, I think I would definitely recommend the color version, even though it is a bit more expensive. So, as for the book itself, of course, as always, I will give some non-spoiler thoughts before I go through the actual plot of the book. Which, as I've said many times before, Bloodruth is the one character that really jumped out to me personally out of all the different characters that we've been introduced to in the Rippaverse so far. So, this book was probably my personal most highly anticipated release from them so far. And I can say without a doubt, this book absolutely did not disappoint. I absolutely love this title. Everything about this was pretty great to me. Which this book was written by the Saska sisters, Jen and Sylvia, the same writers we had for Yaira #1, which was also a book I enjoyed quite a bit. But I think I like this one more. In fact, I think this might be my favorite Rippaverse release overall so far out of everything they put out. So, I really like the story in this book. The art was done by Michael Montenot. I hope I pronounced that name right, because the art is fantastic in this book. I thought it was really well done. Which this artist was actually one of the winners of their fan art contests, and that's how he ended up getting this job. So that's really cool as well. But overall, this book, it gives us a lot more information and a lot more backstory on Sydney Bloodruth, which is a character that was first introduced in ISOM #2. So we knew a little bit about this character already, but this book really fleshes things out. We find out a lot more about her background, we find out about her family, we find out some more about her power sets and, how her abilities work and things like that. There's also some really great action in this book, with Sydney facing off against various demonic forces, which I will say, this book is a horror title, and it can have some pretty graphic violence in it, so, I wouldn't recommend this for really young children. There is some dismemberment and some graphic things like that in here, and of course, if you couldn't tell from the title, there is a lot of blood. So, it does have quite a bit of violence, so keep that in mind. There's also some non-explicit nudity towards the end, so, keep that in mind as well. But, yeah, for older readers, at least, teenage or older, it should be fine for them. So, a very cool book. One of the things I just like about it is that there's a lot of stuff in this book that it's just fucking cool. There's, magic spells and demons and vampires and shadow wolves and dragons and just cool shit. It's a lot of cool shit, and I think that's awesome. So, with all that being said, I am going to get into spoiler territory now. So, if you want to read this book without knowing anything that happens, you have been warned. But starting off first, we immediately actually get a scene of Cain and Abel, back from biblical times. And we have Sydney Bloodruth sort of giving a monologue over this entire scene, where she's talking about damnation, and how that started with the first family, and how Cain sinned and was cast out by God, and God put a mark on him, to mark him as the damned, and how, this cursed bloodline carries on from generation to generation, which all of this ties into us learning a little bit more about Sydney's powers, since we learned that the entire Bloodruth bloodline is actually one of these cursed bloodlines. So her family is cursed, to just like Cain's family was for some ancient sin, I suppose. So this cursed blood is actually what gives Sydney and the rest of her family her powers. So that lets them use blood magic and have the abilities that they have. However, this blood also attracts the damned. So all the demonic things that they end up having to fight is sort of drawn to them because they have this cursed blood. So it's sort of a double-edged sword in the fact that you get powers from it, but you also have to use those powers to fight all this evil shit. So we then cut to a scene of Sydney in the middle of a fight in a graveyard somewhere, where she's fighting against a bunch of vampires, and she is looking for someone. We don't know who. She's just referring to him as he. But she's fighting these vampires and looking for this mystery guy, and in the middle of this fight, a woman appears, who Bloodruth clearly knows, but we don't know who this is at this point. But we get a look at this very powerful vampire lady, who is actually making blood rain from the sky. So this blood rain actually causes some creatures that she calls her plasma children to rise up out of the ground, which is basically like some blood zombie kind of things. So these plasma children rise up and start chasing after Sydney. So Sydney ends up running away to a nearby church where she busts through the window. And once she's inside the church, it's considered holy ground. So, these vampires and zombie things can't step inside there and go after her. So they all end up leaving, and Sydney manages to escape. So Sydney winds up returning home to the Bloodruth Manor, where she meets up with the wyvern that she was flying around on in ISOM 2, who we learned is named Othello. So we get to see the wyvern again, we get to see her shadow wolf familiars again, which that was one of the things I really loved about the character, in her first appearance, where she had all these pets or familiars or whatever you want to call them. So I was glad that we got to see some more of them in this book. So anyway, she ends up going inside and she meets up with her father, who is named Dominic Bloodruth. And her father's just sort of sitting there staring out a window, and Bloodruth is trying to talk to him about what just happened to her, and he's not responding at all. He's pretty much just completely ignoring her. So she ends up leaving and walking down the hallway, and we have a scene where she sees a family portrait on the wall. So we get a look at Bloodruth's full family, and we get to see both her parents, both her brothers, and herself in this portrait. And the big reveal in this is that her mother in this portrait is actually the same vampire lady from before who attacked her in the graveyard. So Sydney's mother has been turned into some sort of vampire creature and is now hunting her down. So obviously that has something to do with why her father's not talking to her at the moment. So anyway, Sydney ends up talking about how some dark aura is pulling her towards Flores Park, and she knows that there's something evil that is there that she has to hunt down. So she ends up gathering up her supplies, and she ends up taking off to Flores Park. And she wants to travel, not drawing much attention to herself. So, of course, she decides to fly there on the back of a wyvern, as one does. So, anyway, she goes to the outskirts of Flores Park, and she lands Othello in a small wooded area. So, she hides all her pets there and tells them to wait on her. And she goes out into the desert and draws a sort of spell circle on the ground in order for her to cast a spell and try to figure out where this evil entity is. So she almost immediately gets interrupted by a little round drone robot rolling into her spell circle. And it is revealed that this drone comes from Gooding. So we get another appearance from Gooding, and we end up having a short little Toku misunderstanding fight, where Sydney ends up attacking Gooding, thinking that, maybe he's working for whoever this he is that she's on the lookout for. So Gooding is trying to explain to her in this fight that, he doesn't mean any harm, and he's actually friends with Dominic, and he had sent Dominic a message and never heard back. So when he saw Bloodruth flying in on the wyvern, he thought that Dominic received his message and sent her to help him. So Gooding ends up explaining that he's been hired by some clients of his to investigate some unnatural phenomenon that's been going on. And Sydney ends up pointing out that she sees a nearby castle that she thinks could be the source of some of this, mysterious stuff that's going on. Which this is the same castle that Avery actually first encountered Sydney in ISOM 2 when he goes out in the desert and finds her. She's living in this castle. Which this entire book is set before the events of ISOM 2, so you can kind of see where this is going at this point. But anyway, Gooding ends up taking Sydney to meet up with the clients who have hired him, and the clients turn out to be Michael Copper and Lillian Ronashi, two of the recurring villains throughout the various Rippaverse series. So Michael and Lillian end up explaining that they actually recently purchased that castle that's out in the desert, and when they tried to go into it, they ran into an undesirable inside the castle, and they hired Gooding to take care of this, which Gooding was not necessarily equipped to do. So Gooding contacted Dominic to get his help, and of course, Sydney has ended up arriving now. So Sydney ends up agreeing to help them deal with this entire situation, and she ends up writing out a blood contract with her powers that says that she'll do the job, but as payment, she's going to get to name anything she wants that is within Michael and Lillian's means, of course, to give her. Which Michael had already promised her, anything they own could be hers if they'll take care of this job for them. So Michael ends up agreeing to it and signing the contract, and Gooding goes on to explain a little bit about what he's discovered so far in the area, about how when you get close to the castle it starts getting hotter, and all your technology stops working, so all of his little gadgets couldn't help him any. So while all this is going on, Bloodruth is actually using her powers, and, she can tell that something is up with Michael and Lily, and she can sort of see right through them. And she knows that they're up to no good, as always. So she's doing the glowy eyes thing and looking at them, and apparently this is one of her abilities that allows her to sort of see the truth about people or something. Since, she looks at Michael Copper and she sees some of his Fight Club dealings that have been going on, and she sees Lillian, having the purple eyes right back at her. So, based on what little we've seen from the upcoming, Michael and Lillian books that are going to be coming out as well, Sydney was able to tell just by looking at them, some of their abilities and some of their backstory and stuff. So she already knows that, these two are not to be trusted. So anyway, Sydney and Gooding end up leaving, and before they go back to the castle, they actually stop off at a church briefly, since Bloodruth needs to go inside and collect some holy water. And when she goes inside, she actually finds someone else in there, and we have a brief cameo from Stefania, which you will remember from Yaira number 1, if you read that book. And of course, again, this takes place before the events of that book, so this is when Stefania is still a member of that gang that she was in, and had the, I got into a fight with a weed eater haircut. So we see her inside the church praying in Spanish, and she's just praying for her grandmother and talking about how, she knows that she's done some bad things in her life, but she was doing them for good reasons. So anyway, Sydney ends up approaching her and asking her if she needs any help in Spanish. So I guess Sydney can speak a little bit of Spanish at least. So when she approaches Stefania immediately just threatens her and runs away. So just a brief little appearance from Stefania there. So next, Sydney and Gooding end up returning to the castle, and since none of Gooding's, little contraptions can actually work inside the place, he realizes that he's not going to be able to be much help in there. So he ends up staying outside to make sure nothing gets in or out. And Sydney goes in on her own, along with her 2 little Shadow Wolf familiars and her pet falcon as well. So they go inside and she's exploring the castle, and she ends up encountering a greater demon named Choke, who is in a ballroom dancing around with a corpse. So as soon as she encounters this thing, we immediately have a flashback scene. So it shifts to a scene where Sydney was still a young child, and it shows her and her whole family sitting in a church, which during this little flashback we actually see 2 more members of Bloodruth's family, which are never named in this, so I'm not totally sure who they are. I'm assuming that they're probably Sydney's grandparents, since they look older than her parents. But yeah, we saw both her parents and both her brothers there, as well as these 2 other people. So probably her grandparents. But anyway, it cuts back to Sydney in the castle, and this greater demon, Choke, is trying to dance with Sydney now. So, of course, she ends up sidestepping him, and she's trying to figure out how he got here in the first place. So she ends up laying hands on one of the corpses that is sitting in this room, and through her powers, she is able to see some of the last moments of this corpse. So we get another flashback to this same ballroom from what appears to be many years ago when things were still good. And we hear about the master of this place is holding this dinner party, and he's summoning demons at this party for entertainment. So he ends up summoning Choke, and Choke comes out and ends up killing everybody. So Choke has murdered all the people in this room. So Sydney finds this out, and she realizes that, she has to send Choke back to the hell realm that he came from. So when Sydney prepares to fight Choke, she actually uses her powers, and she basically goes full Kamen Rider and just manifests a suit of armor out of nowhere, when I definitely did not see that one coming. But she gets this entire sort of, medieval knight-looking sort of suit of armor on. And her demon wolves end up fighting against Choke. But Choke is so strong, he's actually still managing to overpower her. So Sydney ends up using her powers again to actually reanimate and strengthen all the corpses in this room. So all the reanimated corpses end up attacking Choke and distracting him long enough for Sydney to pull out a vial of the holy water that she collected earlier in the church, and she throws it into Choke's mouth, and he swallows it and ends up exploding from it. So Choke has been taken out by the holy water. Which, after this fight, Sydney does briefly collapse, which is something that was already established in ISO number 2, that when she uses her powers, it does drain her blood from her. So if she uses her powers too much, she ends up becoming weak and can potentially pass out from it. So she is limited on the frequency with when she can use her powers. But she does manage to recover from that fairly quickly, and she decides to go on and explore the rest of the castle, since she believes that that was the only undesirable in there. So she wants to explore the castle and learn why Michael and Lillian wanted it in the first place, and also potentially find something to, claim as her payment for this job. So as she's exploring around, she ends up finding all sorts of powerful magical objects. She ends up finding this really weird, evil doorway hidden deep within the castle. And she can sense something very bad on the other side of that door. So she's not going to open it, and she wants to make sure that nobody else is able to open it either. So she keeps looking around, and she also finds a room that is full of paintings. But each one of these paintings is actually like a portal to another realm. So this room is absolutely full of these things. So there's all kinds of different dimensions and things that she can go to. So she's starting to realize that, Michael and Lillian wanted this place because it's absolutely jammed full of all these powerful artifacts. And she knows that if any of them fall into the wrong hands, some very bad things can happen. So she knows that she can't let Michael and Lillian get a hold of this stuff. But anyway, she keeps on exploring, and she also ends up finding a library full of a bunch of magical books and things. Which one of the books she pulls off the shelf is called Into the Void. And she opens it up, and it's actually another portal to some other sort of dimension. And it actually almost pulls her in her weakened state. So she slams the book shut and puts it away. But as she's exploring this place, there's been a little moth that's been flying around following her. And her pet falcon actually tried to eat it at one point. But anyway, she flicks this moth away. And it turns out that it was not a moth at all. In fact, it was another greater demon that has been summoned to this place. So it transforms from a moth into a more humanoid form and reveals itself to be Deer Tick. So this Deer Tick demon is pissed at Sydney for, putting her hands on her books. So they end up getting into a fight, and Deer Tick attacks Sydney with sort of these razor sharp rose petal things. So Sydney's already in a weakened state from her fight against Choke, and Deer Tick is clearly more powerful than Choke was. So Sydney's trying to get away from her, and in the process, she ends up pulling off another one of the books from the shelf, which is called Great Inferno. So she opens up this magic book, and you guessed it, a Great Inferno comes out of the book. So Deer Tick gets blasted with this big stream of fire, which also destroys some of the books in the room. So Deer Tick ends up getting even more angry since some of her books has been destroyed now. So she goes after Sydney again, but her little falcon pet comes in and attacks her to try to help Sydney. So Deertick ends up getting a hold of the falcon, and she looks like she's about to kill it, until she also gets attacked by the 2 shadow wolves. So the wolves are fighting back against her now, and Deertick realizes that shadow wolves can't exist in like really bright lights. So she ends up blasting like a really bright light at both of them and causing them to sort of disintegrate temporarily. However, all this does give Sydney an opportunity to knock a bookshelf over on top of Deertick and crush her, which at first she thinks manages to kill her, but it turns out that Deertick did not die from the shelf falling on her, and instead she actually forced her to turn into her true form, which is this giant, monstrous insect thing. So she becomes this really ugly thing and ends up attacking Sydney again and blasting acid out of her mouth at her. So Sydney ends up using her powers again to draw another spell seal on the ground, which can hold Deertick temporarily, but it's not going to hold for very long. But she just needs that to hold her long enough for her to go grab that Into the Void book again, when she opens up and uses it to suck Deertick into whatever void dimension that book leads to. So Sydney has managed to defeat the second greater demon that is inside this castle, but she had to use more of her powers in order to use it, so now she's even more weaker than she was before. So she ends up collapsing on the ground, and she wants to just rest her eyes for a minute. So she ends up having a hallucination during this, where she sees herself like out on a lake sitting in a boat with one of her brothers, who is named Abel Bloodruth. So her and Abel are out on this boat, and Abel is talking to her about how the devil fears the Blessed Mother above all, and the devil is after Sydney now, and, after he takes her out, there'll be no Bloodruths left in order to stop him. So Sydney ends up hugging Abel, but he bursts into flames, and they both jump into the lake. So Sydney ends up underwater with a bunch of zombie corpses things trying to grab her and pull her down. So she's realizing in the middle of this that, none of this is real and it's a hallucination. So she's trying to wake herself up from it, and she doesn't completely leave the hallucination, but she leaves the underwater part. And instead she wakes up on a beach somewhere. So she's still hallucinating, but now she's in a different area. So she's walking along this beach, and she sees a staircase randomly leading up to nowhere. There's flames at the top of it. So then she encounters her other brother, who is named Casey. So Casey ends up telling her that, all these demons are scared of his little sister, and, all this is just what their parents had trained them for. So Sydney talks about how, she wishes that all of them were here to help her, and Casey ends up saying that they are here for her, and kisses her on the forehead. So finally Sydney manages to wake up from this hallucination about her family. So she decides to continue exploring the rest of the castle to see if she can find out exactly how all these demons ended up getting summoned here. So she ends up exploring around until she finds the dismembered body of some random guy. So she goes up to him, and she realizes that, this is the person who started all this, and he's the one who summoned these demons here in the first place. So she's checking out, what's left of him, and she realizes that he still has a magic heartbeat. So apparently, even though this guy's body is laying here in multiple pieces, somehow he's still alive. So she ends up using her blood magic on him, and she is actually able to stitch his body back together and return his soul to his body. So she ends up bringing this guy back to life, which again immediately causes her to collapse because, her powers are running low. But she brings this guy back, and this guy is thanking her for helping him out, and he introduces himself as Edward Alexander Crowley. So Edward is trying to apologize about summoning all these demons and saying that, that wasn't his intention to do all this, and things sort of, got out of hand. And he's apologizing to Sydney for making her having to, fight all these Hellions to get to him, which Hellion seems to be a catch-all term in this universe. Since, in ISOM 2, when we saw Sydney and ISOM fighting against those ape things called devlings, they were referred to as Hellions as well. So apparently devlings are just one type of Hellions, and all the greater demons and devils and stuff that are in this book are also categorized as Hellions. So those seem to be just any sort of creature from one of these various different hell realms. So anyway, Edward is apologizing for all that, and in the middle of this, he sort of casually mentions that, he'd be pissed too if he had to kill 3 greater demons and a devil to get here. So Sydney is shocked by this because she realizes that there's still one more greater demon and a devil somewhere in this castle. Which almost immediately after they realize this, they end up getting attacked by the last greater demon in the castle, which is a demon named Fae, which is this weird 4-armed sort of fairy-looking monstrosity thing. So Fae shows up and again immediately disintegrates Sydney's shadow wolves, so they can't help her. And Fae ends up grabbing both Sydney and Edward, which Edward is apparently a pretty powerful magic user himself, and since he's the one that summoned all these demons, he is also capable of sending them all back. So to make sure that he's not able to do that, Fae actually ends up chopping off both of Edward's hands and sewing his mouth shut, so he can't say any spells. So Fae wants Sydney to be a sacrifice for her master, which her master is the devil that Edward summoned into this castle as well. So Fae knows that Sydney's powers come from her own blood, and her clothes are covered in her own blood at this point. So she actually ends up stripping Sydney down and putting her in this white gown instead. So Fae ends up taking both Sydney and Edward to meet her master. So we then get the reveal of the most powerful devil that has been summoned into this place, who is named Morning Star, who has a really cool design. Which apparently devil is a higher rank of evil thing than greater demon is. So apparently these greater demons are all serving him. So Fae ends up bringing Sydney to Morningstar, and Morningstar is talking about how he wants to consume her. And in the middle of this, we end up getting a flashback, and we actually find out, the full story of what happened to Sydney's family. Because Sydney mentions that this is not the first devil that she has encountered. So we see a flashback to a church, and there's this chained up casket inside, and her whole family is there to fight whatever is inside this casket. So we see both her parents and both her brothers and Sydney herself. So they end up opening this casket, and there is no ordinary Hellion inside of it. Instead, it is an ancient vampire devil named Silk, who again has a very cool design, somewhat similar to Morningstar's actually, except he's sort of got demon bat wings instead of the creepy angel wings that Morningstar has. So the Bloodruths end up trying to fight against this Silk, and he doesn't have any of the normal weaknesses that a vampire would have. He's inside of a church and he's not bursting into flames, and he's not melting in the sunlight, and they shoot a stake through his heart with a crossbow, and he just no-sells it entirely. So none of the usual things will work on him. So during this fight, he ends up attacking Sydney's brother, Abel, and he says that he's always wanted a son. So he ends up breathing some kind of demon breath into him or something. Anyway, he ends up possessing Abel. So he collapses to the ground, and Sydney runs over to check on him. Meanwhile, he goes after Sydney's mother as well, and he ends up biting her and kissing her. So she drops to the ground and she's screaming in pain. So while Sydney is checking on Abel, Abel ends up springing back to life and grabbing Sydney by the throat. So he's under Silk's control now and is attacking Sydney. And when Sydney turns back around, she realizes that her mother has been brought back to life as well. But now she has become Silk's vampire queen. So this is the form that we saw her in earlier at the beginning of the book when Sydney was attacked by her. So Silk has taken control of both Abel and Sydney's mother. So Silk sends the mother to attack Dominic and bring him his head. So she's going to decapitate her real husband. And he also tells Abel to finish off Sydney as well. So Sydney ends up calling for Othello in the middle of this. So her wyvern friend ends up busting through the wall and attacks Silk and manages to rescue Sydney, Casey, and Dominic and get them out of there. So the rest of the family survived, but the brother and the mother are still under Silk's control. So when they get back home, Dominic, Sydney's father, is very pissed at her for running away. And he claims that, if they stayed, they could have saved Abel and her mother as well. And he says that even if they couldn't, they could have at least died with some dignity. So Dominic is blaming Sydney for this entire thing since, she chose to run away instead of staying and fighting. So that's why their relationship is the way it is, when we saw them interacting earlier. So a very tragic backstory for the Bloodruth family. But anyway, after that, it cuts back to, present times with Sydney in the castle facing Morningstar. And Morningstar ends up taking her to that doorway that she discovered earlier and talking about how only the blood of the damned can open this door. So Morningstar apparently understands how Sydney's powers work, and apparently her blood needs to make contact with stuff in order for her to see the things that she sees. So Morningstar goes over and cuts her cheek open, and that allows her to receive a vision that he wants her to see. So he ends up showing her this possible future for her where Morningstar is ruling over this hell realm, and Sydney has chosen to become his bride, and she's given birth to an entire army of demon babies. Shout out Dave Landau. But we get some really awesome artwork here with Sydney as, Morningstar's bride and concubine, and her leading this entire army of these, demon creatures to fight against the armies of heaven. And Sydney's talking about how Morningstar is showing her all these things because he wants her to choose this path. It's not enough to, force her into it. She has to make that decision of her own free will. So Morningstar also shows her visions of what would happen, if she continues living her life like she is now. And he shows her that her father just ends up dying eventually. And eventually she ends up dying too, and she never manages to save the rest of her family. So instead he wants her to choose to become the mother of the Antichrist and become sort of this demon queen for her. So she can have, infinite life and anything she could ever want and just rule over this evil hell world that he creates. So after being shown all these visions, Sydney ends up collapsing to the ground, and she's talking like she might actually end up agreeing to this. And she's talking about how, both Morningstar and her have been cursed by God, and how she's had this emptiness inside her entire life, and she never understood it before. And she says that everyone she's ever loved has become some dark thing, and it's hurt so bad because she's always fought against joining them. So as she's saying all this, she's sort of crawling across the ground, and she crawls over to Edward, who is laying on the ground in a pool of his own blood. And she ends up taking some of Edward's blood, and she pours it all over herself. So you can sort of tell she's up to something at this point. But she keeps talking to Morningstar like she's, getting on board with this idea of joining him. So she ends up standing up, and she calls Morningstar her master. So she says he's going to slip out of her dirty clothes so that they can consummate their union. So she slips out of the gown that they put on her earlier. But when she does so, she has these markings all over her body now in blood. And she starts reciting the Hail Mary prayer in Latin. So, of course, this was all a trick. She used the power from Edward's blood to revitalize herself enough to use this prayer/spell against them. Which, if you remember before, in that hallucination she was having with her brother was telling her that, the devil fears the Holy Mother most of all. So she does the Hail Mary prayer in Latin, and this causes both Faye and Morningstar to burst into flames and burn away. So with that, she has managed to defeat all 3 of the greater demons and the devil that Edward accidentally summoned to this place. So she ends up getting dressed in her actual clothes, and she goes over and she helps Edward, and she uses her powers once again to restore his hands and help him get back to full health, which again almost immediately causes her to collapse. So Edward is thanking her again, and Sydney is thanking Edward for, offering his blood to her in order to give her enough strength to be able to do that in the first place. So as both of them leave, Edward reveals that the 3 demons and the devil weren't the undesirable that Michael and Lillian were mentioning. The undesirable was him, so they just wanted him out of there. So Sydney is telling him to leave with her. So they go to walk out the door, but when they do, it's revealed that Edward can't actually leave this castle. There's some sort of magical barrier stopping him from leaving. So he is permanently trapped inside the walls of this castle. So Sydney ends up going and she meets up with Gooding again, and they return to Michael and Lillian. And Sydney ends up telling them that she has named her price for this job, and her price turns out to be the entire castle and everything in it. So Lillian gets super pissed about this because she realizes that, they just lost everything that they were trying to get, all the magical artifacts and shit that they were trying to get their hands on. So she blames it all on Michael for signing the contract that agreed to, let her have anything that they own. So she's fussing with Michael about that, but Michael ends up pointing out a newspaper article that mentions that some company called Aztec has just declared bankruptcy, and they decide that they're going to buy this company out instead and use it as a cover for their shady dealings that they have going on. So a bit of foreshadowing there for some of their things in the future. So that is how Sydney comes to own the castle that, she has at the beginning of ISOM 2 when Avery first meets her. So we then have one final scene at the end of the book here where Sydney returns to the castle and she tells Edward that, she now owns it. And since Edward can't leave the place, that means that he's become her involuntary tenant and she's now his landlord. So she starts laying down some ground rules for him, talking about how he can't summon things anymore or do spells or, cause the trouble that he's been getting into. So while they're arguing about that, on the very last page, we had a surprise little teaser, which I was not expecting this at all, but I'm really glad that we got this. Because we finally got the first official appearance of Dokumon. Which, if you've been following the Rippaverse since the beginning, Dokumon is a character that we've known about, but has never explicitly appeared in any of the books. He's been in some of the promotional material, those card archives that they've been releasing as some of the merch items in a lot of their collections have been framed as information that Dokumon has gathered on the various characters in this universe. So we don't know much about Dokumon himself other than he's this, shadowy, evil-looking entity. But we get a brief appearance from him at the end where he's talking about how the beginning of the end is coming and consequences of actions on a cosmic scale are on the way and can't be stopped. And he says that others will know and others will come. And it's all going to happen in Flores Park. So it was really cool to finally see Dokumon officially in a book for once, even though it was just this brief teaser that didn't really tell us anything. I'm glad that we finally got to see him and know that we are building towards, whatever big sort of cosmic threat that he's going to end up being. But yeah, that was Bloodruth number 1. So, like I said before, I absolutely love this book. I think it is my favorite release from the Rippaverse so far. This character has always been the character that has most resonated with me right off the bat. Again, mostly because of her, familiars and animals and stuff. I always love characters like that who have, animal companions fighting alongside them. So I'm glad we got to see a lot more of her familiars in this book. I like, the way they took this character. They made her very sympathetic. with the entire situation with her family. I really liked the plot of the book itself, but I also liked the overarching plot that they set up with, two of her family members being under Silk's control and her wanting to track down Silk and possibly save them. So that's a really interesting, overarching story that can carry on into future issues of this book, which we actually already have, Bloodruth number 2 confirmed, which they revealed back during that Rippaverse showcase. So, don't know exactly when that's coming, but it shouldn't be too long before we get a follow-up to this story, which I am absolutely looking forward to. So, yeah, I can't recommend this book enough. If you've never read any of the Rippaverse books, you can pick this up right off the bat and enjoy it. You don't have to have any prior knowledge or anything. Obviously, there's some characters who appeared in this, who appeared in the other books. We had Gooding, we had Michael and Lillian. But, even if you don't have any background knowledge on any of those characters, you still can fully enjoy this story. So, yeah, I've been a fan of pretty much everything the Rippaverse has put out so far. And, I talked about how I really liked Yaira, and I really like the Horsemen specifically. But I think Bloodruth right now is the storyline that I am the most invested in, personally. Which, I know they've talked about wanting to do an animated series for the Horsemen, but I actually think the way they set up Bloodruth, it actually lends itself really well to have some sort of ongoing animated series. If they wanted to go that route, I think they could very easily make like a, Constantine-esque sort of show where Bloodruth is facing off against various, demonic entities every episode. And again, you could have that overarching plot of, Silk being the big bad that builds, towards the season finale where she finally faces off against him. So I think there's a lot of potential there on the animated side if we get to that point at some point for Bloodruth, potentially even more so than the Horsemen. Which, another thing, again, I know this is sort of pie in the sky at this point, but this crossed my mind while reading this book. And I know Eric has at least mentioned wanting to, get into the video game realm. And I was thinking that like a 2D Metroidvania style Bloodruth game, where she's just hunting vampires, basically a Castlevania clone but with Bloodruth. I think that has a ton of potential. And, doing a 2D style game like that could keep the budget a lot more under control than trying to do some big, 3D open world, giant game or something. So, if they wanted to go that route, I would 100% be on board for something like that. If they could team up with some, experienced studio like an NT Creates or something, and have them make a Metroidvania-style Bloodruth game, I would 100% be on board for something like that. So, just something to think about there. But yeah, I guess that's about all for this video. I, of course, will continue my Rippaverse videos in the future, which I'm actually not totally sure which book I'm going to be getting my hands on next. I know that Yaira number 2 is supposed to start fulfilling pretty soon, and I think they've already started fulfillment on the Great War of Separation number 1, which I have both those books pre-ordered, but I pre-ordered the Great War of Separation along with Ripazine number 3. And I'm not totally sure when Ripazine number 3 is going to start shipping. So, I don't actually know for sure which one of those books is actually going to be sent to me first, due to the way I ordered them. But whatever I end up getting my hands on, I will be covering all those books as well. And of course, right now they have the pre-orders open for both ISOM number 3 and the Zaylan one-shot. So, I don't have those pre-ordered yet, but I do plan on picking up both those pretty soon as well. So, I will be covering all those as I get my hands on them. Again, not totally sure in what order I'm going to be actually receiving all those, but as I get them, I will be covering all of them. So, anyway, I guess that's all I got to say, so lots of luck to you and yours.